Christian K. Ross was a wealthy man with a very high social status, living with his family in their large stone mansion on East Washington Street in Germantown, a suburb of Philadelphia within the city's limits. At that time, his family consisted of his wife and 7 children: Stroughton, Harry, Sophia, Walter, Charlie, Marion, and Annie. Charley Ross, a 4-year-old boy, was a chubby child with long, curly blonde hair. His appearance, intelligence, and nature made him beloved by everyone he met. His 6-year-old brother Walter was his constant companion. On June 27, 1874, 2 men passed by the Ross mansion in a horse-drawn carriage. When they saw Charlie and Walter playing on the nearby sidewalk, they stopped and, after giving the children candy, began to talk to them. From then on, these 2 men continued to pass by daily, always engaging with the children whenever they were in sight. On the afternoon of July 1st, they stopped again, and Charley Ross asked the men if they could take him for a ride in the carriage and if they could buy him candy and fireworks to celebrate the upcoming Independence Day. The strangers readily agreed to his requests and took Charlie and Walter into the carriage. After traveling a short distance, Charlie asked why they didn't stop at a store to buy candy. But the men told him they were going to Aunt Susie's, where they could get a lot for just 5 cents. When they reached the intersection of Palmer and Richmond Streets, Walter gave 25 cents and was directed to the corner store where fireworks were sold. While he was buying them, the kidnappers drove off with Charlie. When Walter came out of the shop, he started crying, realizing he was left alone. Among the sympathizers who gathered around him was Mr. Henry Peacock, who eventually took him back to his father. Several people reported seeing the carriage pass when both boys were inside, but no one was found who had seen it after Walter left, and no trace of the horse or carriage could be found. The motive behind the kidnapping was initially unclear, and many theories were suggested. Some claimed that family issues had prompted a relative to kidnap the favored child, while others said he had fallen into the hands of gypsies. Some even expressed the opinion that the child had simply been hidden by Mr. Ross for the sake of publicity. On July 3rd, Mr. Ross received a letter sent from Philadelphia. The letter stated, "July 3rd, Mr. Ross, do not worry, your son Charlie is safe. We have your son, and no earthly power can get him out of here. You must pay us before you can get him back, and you will have to pay a substantial amount as well. If you involve the police in searching for him, you only weaken your chances. We have your son hidden in a way that no living force can reach him. If anyone approaches where he is hidden, it will be a signal to kill him immediately. If you care for his life, do not let anyone look for him. Your money can get him out alive, and there are no other powers available. Do not deceive yourself into thinking the investigators can recover him from us, as it is impossible. We will contact you again in a few days." When the content of this letter became public, officials decided that strict measures were necessary. Not just in Philadelphia, but across the entire country within a radius that extended several miles around the city. An unprecedented search operation was launched by American police officials. The public's outrage in the area became so intense that officers felt secure enough to ignore legal details regarding the search of private property. Any location where its occupants were not above suspicion was searched, and any protests caused authorities and neighbors to examine the protester with suspicion. Similarly, ships on the river were inspected, yet no trace of the missing child was found, although thorough searching recovered a vast amount of stolen property, and the thieves were later prosecuted. In the meantime, parents, especially among the wealthy, were so terrified that they kept their children in a state of near confinement. On July 6th, Mr. Ross received a second letter, also sent from Philadelphia, in which the kidnappers demanded a ransom of $20,000 and threatened to kill Charlie if investigators were called in or if their demands were not met. The letter also mentioned that if Mr. Ross wanted to communicate with his child's captors, he should place a personal ad in the Philadelphia Ledger as follows: "Ross, we are ready to negotiate." On July 7th, Ross responded as required, and on the same day, he received another letter asking him to state in a personal ad whether he would accept the terms. It was then decided to continue responding to the letters, and to craft the answers in a way that would necessitate further correspondence, with the hope that eventually something might be revealed that could help track down the boy, or mistake could lead to the discovery of the writer. Accordingly, the response to the last letter was, Ross will accept the terms as best as he can. On July 9th, another letter was written in response to the last personal ad, where the kidnappers mentioned they were beginning to feel bored and that the reason for the evasive responses was clear to them. Despite the tone of the kidnappers' last letter, Ross continued to publish ambiguous replies, after which he declared that he would not commit a crime by paying money to the monsters who committed this heinous act. However, when Ross observed the mental and physical state of his wife, he regretted the stance he had taken, and through personal columns in the Ledger, he expressed his desire to reopen negotiations, leading to a response from the kidnappers, who chastised him for his impulsive and unwise actions. On July 22nd, Philadelphia Mayor Stokely, on behalf of several other citizens, offered a reward of $20,000 for the capture of the kidnappers. On the same day, Ross informed the kidnappers through the usual channels that he would comply with their demands in every detail. In response, the kidnappers expressed their reluctance to enter into any further negotiations at that time, claiming that the moon was not in a suitable phase for conducting business. The reason for this statement would become clear later. On July 30th, the kidnappers instructed Ross to obtain a suitcase, paint it white, fill it with $20,000 in small bills, and board a train heading to New York at midnight. He was directed to stand on the rear platform of the last car. This train was supposed to arrive in New York about an hour after sunrise. He was warned to be alert from the moment the train left the station, and if he saw a flare or a white flag waving at night near the tracks, or a white flag alone during the day, he should throw the suitcase immediately. If it was found to contain the demanded money, the child would be returned within 10 hours. Ross obtained the suitcase and began his journey, but instead of $20,000, the suitcase contained a letter stating that he would not pay until he saw his child before him. He positioned himself on the rear car and made the entire exhausting journey, but he did not see any signal and returned home, where he found a message from the kidnappers criticizing him for not making the trip. It appeared that one newspaper erroneously reported that Ross had gone in a different direction with some officers to pursue a lead, and believing this information came from a reliable source, the kidnappers abandoned their plans. Because the moon did not appear on the specified night, it is likely they were waiting for a dark night so they could not be tracked. And the reason for painting the suitcase white was so it could be easily spotted that night. Communications resumed, but Ross firmly insisted that the payment and the child's delivery must occur simultaneously. The response to this was sent by mail from New York. The kidnappers stated that simultaneous exchange was impossible and once again threatened to kill the child. On August 2nd, New York Police Chief George Walling sent a telegram to Philadelphia requesting the original letters from the kidnappers, adding that he had reliable information about their identities. Captain Hines of the Philadelphia Police Department went to New York with the necessary papers, and Walling's source identified the writing as belonging to William Mosher, also known as Johnson. The source then mentioned that in April 1874, Mosher and Joseph Douglass, also known as Clark, had tried to convince him to participate in the kidnapping of one of Vanderbilt's children while the child was playing in the grounds surrounding the family's residence in Throgs Neck, Long Island. The plan was to hold the child until a ransom of $50,000 was obtained, and the source's part of the plot was to take the child on a small boat and keep him isolated until the money was received, but he refused to join the conspiracy. He provided a detailed description of both men, and when he described some minor characteristics about them that were not published, but Walter Ross easily recalled when questioned closely, it was agreed that the information was of great value. It was then learned that Mosher was a boat builder and was on the run from justice at that time. In 1871, he had been arrested for burglary in Freehold, New Jersey, but escaped from jail before his trial. After escaping, he and Douglass manufactured a moth-repellent product called Moth-E, traveling around the country with a horse and wagon marketing the product. At the time of the kidnapping, Mosher was residing with his wife and 4 children at 235 Mono Street, Philadelphia, while Douglass was living in the same home. They had a horse and wagon in a stable on Marion Road, but the stable was demolished, and the horse and wagon, undoubtedly the ones used to transport Charley Ross at the time of the kidnapping, disappeared. On August 19th, Douglass and Mosher, along with their families, moved to New York, where Mosher had a brother-in-law named William Westerfield, a former police officer in that city. At this time, the Pinkerton Agency was called in to investigate the case, and every effort was made to apprehend the 2 men. But with no progress made by November 6th, Mr. Ross, who was in constant contact with the kidnappers, replied to their 23rd and final letter, requesting that he send 2 relatives to New York with the required money and to place an ad 2 days in advance through the personal column in the New York Herald stating when they would arrive, to read, "Saul of Tarsus, 5th Avenue Hotel, immediate." They also warned Ross to instruct his relatives not to leave their room at the hotel for a single moment that day. They explained that the person who would come to collect the financial package would be completely unaware of its contents or purpose, and assured him that under no circumstances should the relatives speak to him. They also mentioned that the route he would take with the money had been carefully planned so that it would be impossible to track him without their knowledge, and if he was followed, they would kill the child and escape. If Ross adhered to the plan, they would return the child within 10 hours. Ultimately, Ross decided to act in good faith with them, and on November 15th, the following ad appeared in the New York Herald: "Saul of Tarsus, 5th Avenue Hotel, Wednesday the 18th, all day." On the 17th of that month, Mrs. Ross's brother and her nephew left with the money and followed the instructions, but no one appeared to collect it. This was the last step taken to negotiate with the kidnappers, and Mr. and Mrs. Ross, who had been in a state of physical collapse for months, were on the verge of a mental breakdown when they discovered the outcome of the trip. Despite their bold demeanor, subsequent events proved that the kidnappers knew the police were actively pursuing them and did not dare to emerge from their hideout, even for $20,000, although they were on the brink of starvation. At that time, many wealthy New Yorkers owned summer homes in Bay Ridge, located on the east side of Upper New York Bay. In this area, H. Van Brunt owned his permanent residence, while his brother, Judge Van Brunt of the New York Supreme Court, had his summer home. During the winter, the judge locked up this house, which was connected to a burglary alarm system with his brother's residence. At 2 a.m. on December 14, 1874, the alarm bells began ringing loudly, waking the family of the judge's brother. Mr. Van Brunt thought the wind might have opened a curtain, causing the alarm, and ordered his son Albert to check it. As the son advanced only a few steps, he noticed someone moving around his uncle's house with a candle lit. He hurried back to tell his father, who immediately dressed. Meanwhile, 2 renters named William Scott and Herman Frank were awoken. The 4 men armed themselves with shotguns and pistols and headed to the house, where 2 men were spotted at the front entrance and 2 at the back. It was a cold, dark, rainy night, but the men waited patiently for nearly an hour. Finally, the dark silhouettes of 2 men stealthily emerged from the cellar at the back. Van Brunt, the father, called out, "Halt," but was met with 2 gunshots, fortunately escaping unharmed. He then fired the contents of his gun at the first man, who fell with a cry of pain. The second man then shot at Van Brunt, but luck smiled on him once more. The second thief tried to escape by running forward, where he encountered Van Brunt's son. A struggle ensued, resulting in the second thief falling dead from a bullet wound. The first thief in the back, although nearly collapsed, continued shooting as long as he had ammunition. The gunfire drew the attention of the entire neighborhood, and when the first thief realized he had only moments left to live, he asked for a drink of water. Then, between gasps, made the following statement: "Men, I won't lie to you. My name is Joseph Douglass, and the man over there is William Mosher. He lives in New York, I have no home. I'm single and have no relatives except a brother and sister I haven't seen in 12 years. Mosher is married and has 4 children. He paused for a moment to gather his strength, then continued. I have $40 in my pocket that I earned honestly. Bury me with it. After another pause, he added, Men, I'm dying now, and there's no point in lying. Mosher kidnapped me, and I am Charley Ross. When asked why he kidnapped the boy, he replied, to make money. When asked who was responsible for Charley Ross, he said, Mosher knows everything about the boy. Ask him. He was then informed that Mosher was dead, and to prove it, Mosher's body was dragged to where Douglass lay and lit near the face of the dead man. Douglass, weakening with each minute, whispered weakly, Oh God, help his poor wife and family. Then he added, Chief Walling knows everything about us and has been searching for us, and now he has what he wants. The child will be home safely in a few days. Although the rain was pouring heavily and the dying man was soaked to the skin, he pleaded with them not to move him or force him to speak, so an umbrella was brought and held over him. For over an hour, he writhed in pain. Finally, he lost consciousness, and 15 minutes later, he died. Chief Walling was informed, and investigator Selick, who had known Mosher and Douglass since childhood, was sent to identify the bodies. Selick recognized them immediately, and when he saw a glove on one of Mosher's hands, he said, Take that off, and you will find a finger amputated from an abscess removed years ago. The glove was removed, and the severed finger was there. To ensure the young Walter Ross was not affected in any way, he was not informed of the tragic incident, but was taken to New York for an unknown reason. When the bodies were presented to him, he instantly recognized Mosher's remains as belonging to the man who drove the carriage, and when Douglass's remains were shown to him, he stated he was the man who had given them candy. Peter Callahan, who had seen the children in the carriage with the men, identified the remains. Then Mrs. Mosher was found, and although she admitted she was aware that her husband had kidnapped Charley Ross, she insisted she did not know where he was. After that, Mr. Ross issued a statement saying he was sure that the leaders of the kidnapping plot had been killed and that he had no desire to pursue the parties who had held his child at that time, and that he would offer a reward of $5,000 for anyone who returned his son without asking any questions. On February 25, 1875, the Pennsylvania legislature passed a law defining the crime of kidnapping and specifying penalties of fines not exceeding $10,000 and solitary confinement not exceeding 25 years. But it specifically stated that if anyone who had a kidnapped child returned that child to the nearest sheriff or judge before March 25, 1875, those individuals would be immune from penalty. Despite the law ensuring protection for anyone returning the child, and as an additional incentive, the father offered a reward of $5,000. The child was never seen again. It is presumed he died. Mr. Ross believed his son was still alive, but the main reason he reached this conclusion was that Westerfield, Mosher's brother, told him that he had spoken with Douglass on the day before the latter's death, and Douglass mentioned that Mosher was then arranging plans for a simultaneous exchange of the child and ransom. Mr. Ross placed great importance on Westerfield's statement, even though Chief Walling repeatedly announced he had conclusive evidence that the former police officer was assisting the kidnappers rather than the authorities. Since the boy was able to speak intelligently about his home environment and according to the kidnappers' letters to Mr. Ross, he continually asked them to take him home so he could accompany his mother to the countryside. It was believed that if the boy was still alive, he would eventually have a chance to reveal his identity to someone who could return him home, if still alive, as this case had garnered the attention of the entire world.